Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 20 of the FootMarks podcast. I'm your host, Behram Qazi. You can find me at DefMango on Twitter. And with me, of course, is Jarrod Kimber, who you can find pretty much everywhere. And we talk about Jarrod's latest obsessions in this show. And the latest one is the elusive Indian number 4. I suppose that's everyone's obsession, because if I go to social media or even mainstream media, including top pundits within India, outside of India, even ESPN Cricinfo obsesses over this. Rohit Sharma has talked about it in press conferences. So the Indian number 4 is a huge issue, apparently supposed issue, because as we're going to talk in this show, isn't that big of an issue. But even I, someone like me, was absolutely sold on the fact that this is an issue, and I would even go and talk about it, right? So why is this problem blown out of proportion, Jarrod?
I think it was essentially what happened is that the last World Cup, they didn't make a lot of runs at number 4, right? And then coming in, they had, I think it was a 17 innings period where they didn't score any 50s. I can't remember, maybe from the start of the year through to September. And I think when that happened, people just kind of took those two things and ran with it. There's always been a perception, I think, as well, that India, someone put a really interesting comment up. They said that almost every single year coming into a World Cup, Indians claim they don't have a number 4, which was really interesting to me. And he said the one year that he thought that they didn't moan about it was 2011 when they won. And when you looked at the numbers, you know, Pakistan, and because I think of Asian cricket as being very strong in that 4-5 position. Yeah. Right. You know, that sort of Inzi position, you know, Aravinda de Silva, these sorts of guys. Oh, yeah, exactly. Dad basically invented that format, right? And so for me, I've always looked at it as strength, and I don't think I'd ever really factored in that India just hadn't been as good, right? Yeah. But when I looked historically, they didn't have as many good players. So I think if you go historically, they haven't had as many good players as they probably should have. I think. Oh, what the hell's that?
I don't know how that happened, but.
Did I just put an emoji on the screen? So anyone listening to the podcast, like, what's happening? I put my thumb up and an emoji came up.
Maybe it's your new laptop. Or maybe it's AI. Maybe it's the robots. Should have listened to Stuart Broad.
Maybe I've got a robotic thumb. So when you look into it, they haven't had the number 4s that some of those other countries have had. So you've got now history. You've got 2019 World Cup. And then you had what quite obviously has happened here, which was a bit of a bad run, and injuries played a part, and them trying a bunch of different people played a part. But I think those three things came together, and, you know, people like you and me, I mean, we follow Indian cricket really closely, right? But we don't follow it. Sometimes someone will say something to me from a cricket team, and, you know, from a fan group, like a Pakistani fan will say it, or a New Zealand fan will say something, and I'll be like, what, really? And I think, well, they're watching so much more of their team than I am, right? You know, I'm trying to watch. I mean, what am I trying to watch? Like 25 different teams around the world, like in my job. And sometimes you just think, oh, I've just missed something here, and they know something I don't. And I just looked this up. I was actually going to write an article, if we're being honest, on why India has a problem batting at number 4. And then I started looking into it. You were on the group chat with me. Yeah. You know, it was, Ari and Sean and everyone. And suddenly I was like, oh my God, I think I found the opposite.
Yeah. I remember we even spoke of this on multiple Uncovered podcasts, and I was so convinced that this is an issue for India. But then, of course, your findings have not, like, they haven't said that India is the best at it, but we'll get into all of that. You spoke about the historical aspect of it, right? And Asian sides producing good number 4s. I can name plenty, right? We spoke about Inzi, Miyadad, Sangakkara, Jayawardene, all of these guys were in the middle order. But India, in the top 10, has only one name, which is Mohammad Azharuddin. But then, of course, Rahul Dravid played a part over there for India over the years. He was quite good. And Yuvraj Singh was an absolute outlier, right? He was very, very good as a number 4. But do you think that over the last few years, especially since Yuvraj retired or whatever, India have such a fabled top 3? Even over the years, throughout history, India has had such a fabled top 3 for the most part, right? That maybe because of that, the number 4s haven't scored as many runs?
I think that India traditionally is a much better country at finding top 3 than Pakistan, Sri Lanka. You can throw Bangladesh in there now as well. Though, for whatever reason, those countries seem to be very good at finding middle order players. And I think that India specifically has been better at finding top 3. I don't know why that is. It could just be dumb luck, you know, conditions of wickets, whatever, new ball bowlers, I don't know. And I think because of that, what actually starts to happen, you get to a point of you start to promote the thing that you are good at rather than actually working out what should happen. So Sehwag is a perfect example of, he's thrust into the top when he's an opener and ends up, making his mark in that sort of position. But he only did that because that particular era, India had so many more middle over players. But think about what India has been doing since Sachin started opening. Sachin, Ganguly, Sehwag, all these different guys, going up to the top of the order over and over again. Inzi, I know he's batted higher, but Inzi was pretty much you're a middle order player. Javed Miandad, you're a middle order player. Aravinda, you're a middle order player, and they have stuck with it. So there is a mindset perception, I think, that is different in Indian cricket. And I think, to be honest, if you're being really, really honest, it makes more sense to do what India does than what the other teams do.
No, absolutely. And even
you want your top three to be much better than your next three, but it's not how everyone in all parts of Asian cricket think.
No, I remember growing up, supporting Pakistan, and, I was always of the opinion, a lot of people were, that why don't Pakistan's big players come and bat up the order? Of course, it worked for them at times to come in the lower order, but anyway, we're talking about India and number 4, so we're going to go back to that. Now, whenever this comes up in the news or discourse or some sort of other podcast like ours, people always bring up Yuvraj Singh's name. He is that one name that always pops up, is almost synonymous with the India and number 4 conversation. And like I mentioned earlier and in your piece, Yuvraj is an outlier. There's Viv Richards, Owen Morgan, AB de Villiers, and then there's Yuvraj, because he was just that dynamic player who offered so much at number 4. So do you think that, his skill set was such and his record was such that it's a fair assessment to say that India haven't found a number 4 after Yuvraj? Because he's not easy to replicate.
I think there's a little bit of nostalgia about Yuvraj, and I think the way that he plays means he's remembered more fondly. You're right, he's an outlier. Basically, the 4 guys that you just mentioned there, they are the 4 fastest scoring number 4s for their time, right? And, Viv is on a different planet, and then you've sort of got Yuvraj, who doesn't average anywhere near as much as Viv or Owen Morgan or who's the other one? De Villiers?
AB de Villiers.
Yeah. He doesn't average as much with the bat. He only averages 32, 33, I think. It's not a particularly high average, but because he scores so quickly, it's so noticeable what he does. And he could do that role in that team because they had Sachin and Sehwag and Rahul Dravid and Ganguly and all these other players, around him, and batting behind him as well. So he had
and Dhoni coming under him after a certain.
Well, that's what I mean. Eventually, Dhoni comes in as well, right? So there's so much other skills there, and so he plays that. But I think you'd be hard pressed to say he's one of the best number 4s to ever play ODI cricket, right? But he is one of the more memorable ones. And so I think that is getting confused with him being absolutely exceptional. And he certainly had some years when he was brilliant. But he wasn't as consistent in that. So I do think there's just a little bit of nostalgia for... I mean, Yuvraj was... I wrote one line once about him, and I don't even know where I wrote this line. But I said that when he hits the ball, it's like it rebounds off his aura or his ego. I can't remember. I said one of those two things. Because he doesn't time the ball like other players. And it's very hard to see him... And he's going to be... People are going to be talking about him for a very long time over players who are better than him.
Yeah.
Right? And he is that kind of person. But honestly, when I went back, I was like, he was an above average number 4, but he certainly wasn't anywhere near some of those names we were mentioning before. He wasn't anything like Aravinda or Javed Miandad or Inzi or many of those other number 4s who were absolutely exceptional. Like, if you were to compare his record to Ross Taylor... I think he would pick Ross Taylor 9 times out of 10 for that position. So
I think you would pick Ross Taylor above a lot of players 9 times out of 10 or 7 times out of 10 because Ross Taylor was stellar, at least in the latter half of his career.
But I wonder but I wonder if you ask Indian fans who was better, I think a lot of them would have thought it was Yuvraj. And I don't think there's any real proof of that other than if you're just going on strike rate alone. And I do think that was noticeable too, because if you look at the period he played, we hadn't had an attacking number 4 in a very, very long time, right? So Javed and Inzi obviously played some of the most attacking innings of all time, but Inzi got very defensive towards the end there. Viv Richards, he quits in 1991, I think, So there's a long gap, and Owen Morgan and de Villiers, they come after Yuvraj, right? So I remember in 2003 first seeing him and going, oh, this guy is not like other players. Like, he is a legitimately exciting player. I get it. But I do think when you go forensically through, there's a little bit of sepia in there.
Yeah. And I mean, he won India World Cup. He was the player of the tournament. So that's got to count for something.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
You mentioned Ross Taylor, right? And how he was so good for a prolonged period of time for New Zealand at number 4, probably the best number 4 of his generation. And he retires, and New Zealand all of a sudden have a slump at that position. And India probably went through something similar when Yuvraj retired, even though Yuvraj post-cancer wasn't the same beast that he once was, right? Let's be honest about that. But maybe there's a bit of that as well?
Yeah, I think Rahane is probably the guy they want to do that role, but he plays it in a very different way to Yuvraj anyway. And he does fine in the 2015 World Cup when Yuvraj was out of the game at that point. So yeah, I do think from that point of view that it is a little bit... I think it's a little bit overblown. But I think because of what happens in 2019, where they try 4 different players or 5 different players, it's a lot of players at number 4, and they all fail. It is looked to, and what you would see is that after Yuvraj, so I think he stopped playing regularly in 2013, so around the Champions Trophy around that period. From then on, they go through a lot of different players. So they are not finding someone who is automatically available for that spot. Right. Now, part of the reason they're doing that, of course, is because Virat Kohli and Rohit Sharma could both bat at number 4. They both get sucked into other positions as well. So it's not that they don't have anyone who could bat at number 4. The guy that they actually have to bat at number 4 is needed opening the batting or number 3, which goes back to our original thing, right? Other teams would not... I mean, Rohit Sharma is a natural number 4 in one-day cricket, right? He would be a fantastic player in that role. But he gets sucked into the team at the top of the order, which quite often happens, makes the double hundreds. That's it. You're never moving back to number 4 after that, are you? So, yes, they didn't have it. But part of the reason they didn't have it is because they were stealing those players who could have played that role for other positions.
Oh, that's a fantastic point. And, I mean, one could argue that Rohit, the opener, was where he truly came of age in the format, because prior to that, Rohit Sharma didn't have a stellar ODI record. In fact, he has scored most of his runs after the age of 30. There's a fact check in there. Whoever's listening in can go check that stat. But
one thing I would add there, just because it's the whole Shane Watson became a good Australian player by opening the batting. Shane Watson came back into the Australian team when he was fully in form, right? And almost any position that Shane Watson would have gone into at that point, I think he would have done quite well at. And it's a bit the same with Rohit. When Rohit came back in, he was mature and ready. And it's like, yeah, he could bat it at number 8 and he might have averaged 60, right? Like, you do have to factor those things in. When he was at his absolute best, he was opening. Doesn't mean that opening made him his absolute best. But either way, once he made those runs up the order, they couldn't fill that other position. So it is a different way of looking at it than I think some other teams do.
Yeah, no, a very, very valid point. And if you talk about Rohit Sharma, you go back to like the first or second IPL when he was playing for the Deccan Chargers. He was a middle to lower order batter, right? Even in the first inaugural 2007 T20 World Cup, he wasn't playing in the top order. So there's some food for thought. You mentioned Ajinkya Rahane in the 2015 World Cup. Now, Rahane averaged over 40, just a touch over 40, and his strike rate was in the low 80s, right? Now, might be a bit slow, and those aren't stellar numbers, but they aren't god-awful, right? Particularly in that era. So, I mean, it's not like they had a massive issue over there.
No, and I think what happens in 2015, those are basically the same as Joe Root's numbers. I think Joe Root might average slightly less than him at a slightly quicker strike rate, but I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with that. I think that if we're being honest, the way that T20 cricket was moving forward, Rahane was not particularly a natural one-day player. But he averaged 35 with a strike rate of 78. If he gets that strike rate up to about 85, 88, he probably has a career. But I think we know that Rahane was the sort of player that they could trust in somewhere like Australia, right?
Yeah.
Can play overseas, likes playing quick bowlers and everything else. The problem with Rahane is that he was a much better player of pace by the time he was in his late 20s than he was of spin. The number 4 position, you need to be a good player of spin. So
True.
I think in that case, he wasn't the ideal player for it. But in 2015, because he was so good against pace, he probably had the ability to do that job pretty well. I think he was only. I saw him open the batting actually in his first ODI. I think it was in Durham. He was a very, very talented player, but I never saw him and thought, this is a guy who's going to be a one-day player. I always thought that he would struggle at that level. Look, he played 90 games. He's got a decent average, but too low a strike rate. And he never really made that position his own. But if you're thinking he's a backup that you play in 2015 and 2019, batting at number 4, he'd be a fine player in those kinds of situations.
Yeah, and then of course there's the Ambati Rayudu question. A lot of people who might be listening in would be saying that, well, you had Rayudu and you didn't use him, but that probably requires a separate podcast altogether. Now, let's talk about post-Yuvraj India. They tried a plethora of options at number 4, right? They were trying pretty much everyone over there. No one really got any consistent opportunity at that position. Do you think that was the selectors and the team management dropping the ball? Because had they given someone a consistent run of games, maybe someone would have turned up?
I think KL Rahul, I'm trying to think of what his age was around that 2014, 2015 period. If you'd given him 2 or 3 years and just said, we're coming into the 2019 World Cup, we're going to give you as much opportunity to play in this as possible. If you get to the point where we don't quite think you're ready, we'll just take you out and we'll bring you back in. I think that probably would have been a better option. Instead, what seems to have happened is, because of injuries, because of form, I don't think Indian selection was particularly good up until very recently. I think it's got a little bit better, and I think it was a little bit more. The media is saying this guy's no good, we're going to yank them out. Whereas I think they're a little bit better now and going, no, this guy's good. We're gonna give him some time, like they did with Rahane and like they've done with KL Rahul at times and other things. I think that if they had a more mature selection policy, they probably just would have found someone. And the reason I say that is there's Rayudu, KL Rahul. I'm trying to think of, there's so many players out there that could have done that. Sanju Samson, right? There's so many players who could have done that role at let's say none of them were great. They all would have done it at least good enough that would have given, the team a better base to go from. I think looking for that constant gold medal decision meant they probably missed out on a lot of silver and bronze type level players.
Yeah, I remember there was also this notion that Dhoni should come and bat at 4. I remember Gautam Gambhir used to say this a lot, that I don't think Dhoni should bat so low in the order, he should come up. But again, probably needs a separate podcast. Anyway,
I'm not sure Dhoni was ever good enough at playing spin to bat at number 4 in ODI cricket.
Also, Dhoni was so good at batting in that lower middle order that why would you want to replace anyone over there? Like that was his role and he was just so damn good at it. He won India World Cup, playing that role. Oh, well, he did come or elevate himself in the batting order on that occasion in that final. But anyway, I just think he was too good to be, slotted in elsewhere. Anyway, you also mentioned the 2019 World Cup and how India chopped and changed a lot with the number 4 player and ultimately paid the price as well, you could argue, because when they lost early wickets, they kind of folded versus New Zealand. Now, since that World Cup, they used 11 different players at number 4, which is a touch too many. And they have a plethora of middle order resources right now as well. It's a similar sort of situation that they have quite a lot of options. You've got KL Rahul, Shreyas Iyer, and you've got Ishan Kishan, who's shown that he can bat in the middle order, right? He can give you that bit of flexibility. So do you think that for this World Cup campaign, India should just earmark one of these guys and give them that role that you will be our number 4 for the length of this tournament?
Probably, yes. I think they would be in a better situation if they gave it to one player. Unless that one player looks like they can't hit the ball off the square, I think that would be a far better option than messing around with it. So the 11 players, I just want to mention that briefly because that came up a lot. Ari, who did the research, some of the research for this piece, he mentioned it a lot in his research. And I was like, my first question was, is that a lot? Because this is the sort of thing that happens a lot in Indian cricket. People get really, really fixated with something like, we've done this, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, that's 4 years. And you guys have played like 91 days or 81 days or whatever it is. Like a lot of one-day cricket. And then you go through it and you realize that actually they've had less turnover at the number 4 position than the majority of ODI sides in the entire world. Shout out to Ireland, who had 2 players who played at number 4 between World Cup. But everyone else had a lot of movement. Australia had way more movement, and so did a lot of other teams. So, yeah, I do think from that perspective that, again, that 11 number is a little bit different. But for the World Cup, what I would be saying is, this is when as selectors, and I think cricket selectors are really bad at this compared to some other sports, and I don't know why this is the case. But if you are sure that KL Rahul is your number 4, you pick him to be your number 4 all the way through unless there's an emergency, right? Unless he literally can't do it, because you have to back your own judgment at a certain point, right? Now, there are things that change. Like, let's say he's not making any runs and the team needs someone more dynamic, or they need a left-hander, or whatever the case may be. I understand those sorts of changes. Those are more tactical changes or energy changes. But if he plays in 7 or 8 one-day internationals in a row in the same position, that is much better than chopping and changing all the way through. And if they don't believe me, they can look at their 2019 campaign, right? When it didn't work. So the only reason I would make changes would be based on matchups occasionally, but not that much. And the other one would be if, they're like 1 for 200 or something, and you want Hardik to come in and slap it around, right? Other than that, I would say this is our number 4, and that's what they're going to do.
Yeah, I mean, all sides should be flexible with respect to the batting order in those situations in particular, because sometimes you need a low-value wicket. Someone can just come in and have a crack at it, and if it comes off, good enough. If not, then the regular batter will come. So it'll be interesting to see what they do this time. But okay, so we obviously mentioned that they played a lot of cricket in this period, right? And of course, with the amount of experimentation that India does, and the fact that they were dealt with a lot of injuries, I'm not particularly surprised that so many people played. But, when you try so many people, now Shreyas Iyer has a brilliant record as well. KL Rahul's there. Does that kind of, make things difficult for you with respect to earmarking a sure shot batter for number 4?
Yeah, I mean, I think the injuries are probably the bigger concern. Shreyas Iyer had a great run batting at number 4, and then stops batting at number 4 for a long period of time, comes back, isn't in as good a form, and struggles. They probably should have played Shreyas Iyer at number 4 in more one-day internationals, being that you don't really need to Rohit and Virat Kohli and whoever else, that they're more sure of, right? They don't those players don't actually need to work out their role definition as much. Shreyas Iyer hasn't played a lot of List A cricket, and because of COVID and everything else, it maybe didn't develop as much as they would have wanted him to. I think it would have been much better if they'd gone, okay, this is our guy. He's made a lot of runs. Let's do that. When he's fit, he's available. And who's our number 1 backup? And I think that what's been happening with India, we've seen this with Australia a lot before too, is this constant experimentation because England got ahead of both of them. And so maybe there's a magic number 4. Maybe Sky's the magic number 4, and we'll put him up there. And, maybe, we could try, Rishabh hasn't made as many runs as we would like in one-day cricket, but maybe if he bats, all these sorts of things, which are fair, and I understand them. I don't think they're necessarily wrong ways of looking at it. But if it was a position that they felt they had a weakness in, and they knew they had a young player who hadn't done it enough, I think that might have been a better option in that one spot. Experiment with your number 3s, experiment with your number 5s, experiment with your number 6s. That's where you can play some shots. But I think if they did have any real concern, that's where they should have probably come out of this. And so here's our number 1, here's our number 2, and worst case scenario, let's say, I don't know, before Ishan came along, Sanju Samson's our number 3. We now know our depth chart, right? I don't think they really knew that, and that is an issue.
Yeah, I mean, depth charts are something that they should definitely be making, especially when you have all these wealth of resources in Indian cricket. You've got backups for every position. You know that you've got all bases covered on talent, but it's just game time and giving them that sort of confidence. And just for the record, for people who don't know, that Shreyas Iyer was second on the list of number 4 batters who had 700 plus runs since the last World Cup. He was averaging more than 50, striking at run a ball, which are really good numbers for a number 4. So, maybe like Jarrod said, if they'd backed him more, that wouldn't be an issue. But really, we'll come to know that it's a non-issue, because I'm going to come to the interesting part, right? All the stat analysis that you did, you compared India number 4s to number 4s across the world, and you saw that, they were above average. Then you took the top cricketing nations and they were bang in the middle. But then you took a few out. You kept it just to Sena nations. And you saw that India's number 4s in some years were better and some years they were worse. It was like one of those crisscross sort of things. And you could say that they were just pretty much the same on average if you'd make a linear line or something across them. But here's where it gets interesting. You looked at them, Indian number 4s versus Australia number 4s, and you could see that Indian number 4s were far better than Australia. But we never hear in the Australian media that Australia has a number 4 problem. And this really amuses me.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is to do with the way that I don't think the Australian media talk about the cricket issues as much. On top of that, the Australian media has now been really, not embarrassed, but, people like me, we will say, look, these guys are not taking the World Cup seriously. They're not really planning for this. And then they come out and they win a World Cup in the UAE and we have to go, okay, we're still right and we know we're right, but they've won a World Cup. And we know that really since 2015, Australia hasn't taken any event. Oh, actually, 2015. 2013, they didn't take very seriously. 2017, they didn't take very seriously. 2019, they turned up at the last minute. T20 World Cups have been exactly the same, right?
Yeah.
But when they get there, they basically pick players and then they hope it will all work. And suddenly Marcus Stoinis and Matthew Wade kill Pakistan and they win and go on to, win against New Zealand in the final. So that then says that it's almost pointless for Australian cricket media to focus over who the number 4 is going to be because they're going to pick someone good, right? They're going to pick Marnus, right?
Yeah.
They're going to pick Cameron Green, whoever it's going to be. Glenn Maxwell will bat it for, whatever the case may be. They will pick someone and they will be good. And in some ways, it's a little bit silly. And I raised this with Australian cricket media before. We should still be putting them under pressure because when they fail, you all get on top of them. When they failed in that World T20 or World Cup, T20 World Cup in Australia, everyone really got on top of them. And I was like, well, where were all you guys beforehand? Because they were falling. They had no idea what they were doing beforehand, and the signs are on the wall. So Australia doesn't do that, but it also means that Australia is just doing probably what India will do, which is when it comes down to it. What's India's worst case scenario? Shreyas, they're picking between Ishan Kishan, who I'm not a huge fan of compared to other people, but has been magnificent recently. Shreyas Iyer, who's natural born ODI number 4.
Plus, in India, he has a stellar record, right? And that's where the World Cup will be.
Exactly. And KL Rahul, who has been absolute run machine in so many different positions, despite the fact many Indians don't trust him. He's a fantastic player and quite clearly all of those 3 people, not to mention if Rishabh Kant, I said? Well, I suppose it is Rishabh Kant at the moment. If Rishabh Pant was available, he would also be in that position. Samshu Samson would be a fantastic number 4. There's plenty of options, right? This isn't a case that India don't have any number 4s, right? And it's the same with Australia. I could say that I've got to worry about their number 4 position coming in, which is probably why Marnus is in the squad, if we're being honest, right?
Fair enough.
And that's a very fair thing to say. What I can't say is that Australia don't have a player who can bat at number 4. I would argue they don't know their roles very well, some of these guys, right? And that is an issue. But I can't say that there is no one to bat in that position. In the same way for New Zealand, if you were to say New Zealand don't have a strike spinner. Well, New Zealand do not have a strike spinner, right? I'm not saying at this stage that Ishodi's going to turn up and he's suddenly going to take 20 wickets in this tournament. Chances are Ishodi's only going to play in a handful of games. He's already taken all of his wickets in one game. He might not even take any more, right? That is completely different, right? That's a situation. England don't have any death bowling. Those are things you can't overcome. They might bowl well in the death in this tournament, but they don't have good death bowling coming in. That's not the case with India and Australia at number 4s. But I do think a lot of the discussion is just different ways that the countries are covered. And the problem with India now is that there's so much media and so much social media that every little thing gets absolutely obsessed over. And sometimes the context is just completely overlooked, right? India hasn't stopped breeding number 4s, right? They just had a bunch of injuries and they hadn't quite given anyone a long enough go for injuries and for other experimentation reasons.
Yeah, and plus, like I was mentioning earlier, when you look at those stats of India's number 4s versus global number 4s, they're slightly above average. Then, of course, Sena countries, you see that it's topsy-turvy. Some years they're better, some years they're worse. And they're bang in the middle with, compared to the rest. And when you have that all graph that entirely plotted with each country. So, I mean, it's not that big an issue. And I feel like India... you mentioned the whole media thing, then also maybe they've set higher standards for themselves. And when you can't really find any issues which are glaring, you go and nitpick. Maybe that's, happening over here. But I think what is important...
I think that the shadow of all this is that they haven't won a tournament since 2013. Yeah. And they've had teams who should have won a tournament since 2013. Right? And so you have to... It's very hard to go, they're chokers. because that's not really... It's really interesting because I'm doing a big retrospect on Double Century about all the World Cups. And Lance Klusner gave an interview, I forget the podcast, Chandresh, I think it was, who used to work for the ICC. He gave a really interesting interview where the fascination, of course, with that is that South Africa were chokers, and that played in that and the reign of the two narratives of the World Cup. You listen to Lance Klusner, and what he says is, all tournament, the bottom order carried that team. We never made enough runs up the top to actually beat the best teams. That is true, right? That is what everyone should have been focusing on. And I've been saying that for a long time, that it's usually it's the middle order of South Africa that's quite weak and doesn't do its job. And occasionally it's been the top order. And we focus on everything else. We focus on the rain and, not picking Alan Donald in that game and all these different things. But essentially, it's the same pattern that they've had over and over again, that their ODI batting or their T20 batting has not been good enough from 1 through to 6 in order for them to win World Cups consistently. What are you going to do? They've already said for pretty much the last 10 years now that India is chokers, and anyone who's going to say that has said it in the media, right? So at a certain point, what you need to be able to do is actually discuss some other things that are easier to discuss. The number 4 issue, they weren't making any runs for 17 games. That becomes an issue. Ravi Jadeja hasn't made any runs for 2 years in ODI cricket. That has become an issue. These are not real issues because when it comes down to it, they have talented players, and Ravi Jadeja was fantastic before that period, right? If he's in bad form, he's in bad form. There's not much you can do about that. You can't drop him because he's Ravi fucking Jadeja, right? At a certain point. So I do think from that perspective, again, you've got this, there has to be a conversation about something, right? And, as a Denver Nuggets fan, I think as Denver Nuggets fans, we were pretty sure, the vast majority of us, that we had the best team, right? But for the last 2 years before that, there'd been injury problems. And because of that, we hadn't seen our best players out on the court, right? And our defensive numbers weren't particularly good, right? And so what starts to happen is the Denver Nuggets fans start going, we should trade this player. Or maybe this is not the right coach for us, or everything else. Actually, what really needed to happen was just a run where no one was injured, right? And to trust in that they had actually built the team that we originally thought they had, which was a championship level team, right? It's very easy to say that when you have a brain like mine that kind of works outside of things, right? Most people in the world, and former players, journalists, media people, social media people, are all the same. They're all inside the bubble. And for them, this is the most important thing. And I remember I was listening to a podcast recently, and this guy said this really interesting thing. He said that he found this old phone, and on it had all these old, I can't remember if it was emails or WhatsApps or whatever it was. And it was this time in his work when everything was like so important, and everything was going wrong. And he's looking back and going, none of this mattered. Why were we worried about this? He had absolutely no idea why it was an issue at the time. But at the time, it was all he could think about because he saw these hundreds of messages he sent. Yeah. At the moment, that's exactly where Indian fans specifically are at. And, Pakistan fans are in a similar situation when it comes to the spinners in the middle order. England fans are a little bit more confident because of what's going on before. Australian fans are a little bit like, are they just going to turn up and be good again? New Zealand fans are like, I hope Santner and Sodhi and Ravindra can do something. Everyone's got their things. But the difference is that I think we would agree that India just has the best team all around on paper. England might be better at certain things, which make them a better overall team. But all around, India probably have the best team. There's only 2 options at this point, Behram. If this was 2015, I think the Indian media would be like, they can win this. They're looking great. They're favourites. They should win this tournament. But because it's after 2015 and after 2016 and after 2017 and after 2019 and after, the 24 T20 tournaments we had in the space of 8 minutes, because it's after all of that, I think there is a natural look of, there must be something wrong with this team. There must be something wrong with this team, right? And one thing I would say is, I don't think they lost the World Cup in 2015 because they had, a weak number 4. I don't think they struggled in 2019 because of week number 4. You make a very good point that that they lost out there, but their number 4 was batting against really good seam bowling early on in the game, which is not really what you want your number 4 to be doing in a one-day game anyway. And they also lost their number They lost, the whole top order, right, in 15 minutes.
Yeah,
so,
pretty much.
I think the larger point would be they're not losing these tournaments because of this, right? But if choking's the only thing you could talk about, and I think the choking conversation I think it's there. I think it's a legitimate conversation to have. I don't think it's talked about in the right way, right? As we just talked about with South Africa, right? I just went through that last over today, the Lance Kalusner over, or the last 2 overs, right? Australia had 3 chances to win that game, and South Africa had 2 chances to win that game. And Australia got there on the 4th chance. I think that's right. Run out, catch. Oh, sorry. You got there on the 3rd chance. So they both had stuffed up chances to win that game. And eventually the narrative is set because Australia got their 3rd chance and South Africa missed out on their 2nd chance, right? But there are very, very good conversations to be had about, are the Indians playing a relaxed, free-flowing, confident game at World Cups? And I don't think they are.
Yeah.
Right?
I think that's definitely a thing.
Yeah.
Because when you look at India in bilateral series, you look at them play with this certain kind of freedom, and they are, expressing themselves, and they're going at faster rates as well. Their scoring rate is very, very good. But when it comes to ICC events, you see that scoring rate take a hit, and I guess the pressure seeps in. And the whole hoodoo conversation, I do agree that it's a very valid one to have. I have it all the time. I'm also guilty of having the number 4 conversation, but I guess that'll stop after this podcast because we've learned a few things over here. But I think that, that's what fans and the media does. But maybe after a certain point, it gets into the players' heads as well. I mean, I'm not an international player, but maybe that's the thing, right? But I think it's very important to, as you debunk this in your piece, mention that since the last World Cup, if you look at each batting position's average, India is head and shoulders above the rest of the top teams in the world. And that tells you that India is an elite team. So there's not much to worry about, right?
Yeah, and I think there are teams that bat better at number 4 than them, obviously, and there are teams that bat worse at number 4 than them. But they are above. I think I looked at New Zealand, Pakistan, South Africa, England. Am I missing Australia? Right.
Yeah.
So I compared them to those teams. So those are all the most realistic chances. New Zealand's a bit of an outsider, but those are the most realistic chances of winning this World Cup. And those are the teams with the best solid batting lineups. Right.
Yeah.
And on average, India was better in every single position than that group, right?
Yeah.
And so what are you then looking for, right? At that point, you are looking for an issue that is not there because you need an issue to be there because there has to be a reason that India have been losing. And I completely 100% get that. I am still a fan. I'm just not a fan of, in exactly the same way as other people. So I completely understand that side of things. But once you have a look at it and you're just like, well, they outbat positions 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. It's hard to then say to yourself, this team has a weakness because they don't have a weakness. And that may be the scariest thing to an Indian fan because now you're just like, we should win this. And that's an uncomfortable place to be as well. To go back to the Denver analogy from before, I felt much more comfortable with Denver until they started flying through the rounds, right? And then I was like, well, they are the best team. So now someone's going to work out how to bring them down. Whereas before I was like, if they're just plucky, they'll just keep fighting and they'll work their way. Your brain just does weird things when you're a fan.
Yeah, definitely. And I wonder how much that seeps into, actual players. But anyway, coming back to the number 4's conversation, you've mentioned a few times now that India went 17 innings, without a 50 at number 4, and the average wasn't good. All of a sudden, though, we saw in the recent past in the Asia Cup in the series versus Australia, they started clicking. And all of a sudden, they were averaging 70 or north of 70 in those games. And before that, they were averaging less than 20. So is this just a testament to how the sport functions? Because at times or phases and periods, you'll be bad, and then all of a sudden you'll be good. Because if you have the talent and the resources, they're bound to come good at some point, right?
Yeah, I think that's quite an extreme pattern. But yes, that is how the sport works, right? Like, we know that for a fact. We saw, if you go back to my piece on Basil D'Oliveira, right? Like, averaging a normal amount, then he's averaging in the basement, and then he's making all these runs again, right? That is what happens. And I think that on top of that, India was experimenting and they had injuries, right? So they didn't have Rishabh Pant and Shreyas Iyer or even KL Rahul available to them. So there's their first 3 choices for that position. It means everyone had to go. Like, there was a huge list of people that had to go of very recent times, right? And good players as well, right? And so they certainly had circled through all of those different players at that point. And I don't think anyone can argue with that. And generally, when you are circling through a lot of different players, Ross Taylor is going to be pretty steady for you, right? Rahane is going to be pretty steady for you over a long period of time. If you've got a guy playing 2 games in this position, then not playing it again, and then someone else is coming in, then you're trying someone who's not quite a number 4, but you want to give them a go. Now you actually want to try and make someone into a number 4 who you know is not quite a number 4 at the moment, but maybe will be in the future. Now you're bringing in a senior player, but that's when you often get those really, really low periods, just because there's no consistency, right? You don't learn. The one thing I would say, and I didn't write about it too much in the original piece of the video, is that number 4 is considered the toughest part to bat in T20 and one-day cricket, right? And the reason that it's considered the toughest is you're coming in around the end of the power play, and it's so you've got that changeover period when you're coming in, and so you're either coming in when the ball's still doing a little bit and they're still trying to get wickets, and you can't attack because you've already had 2 wickets go down, or you come in just after the power play. The other team's best spinner is bowling. You're expected to knock it around a little bit. All the field is already out, but you're also 40 overs away from the death, so you can't attack that much. It's a very, very tricky position from that perspective. I spent a lot of time talking to Brad Hodge about this, and him taking me through. One day I'll get him. Actually, I might have already done this podcast with him, but him talking about the many different reasons why it is tricky is so fascinating, and we don't give that enough credit, I think. So of all the positions, I kind of feel at a certain point, if you have openers in your country, if you just pick Phil Salt or Jason Roy or Dawid Malan, they'll make runs eventually, right? I think number 4 might be, and number 5 is also a really interesting position. Those are the 2 positions I think you kind of just need to groove yourself into and to work it out a little bit more. Have you ever batted number 4?
No, I was always like a, number 8-ish, number 7, number 8 at best.
So I've batted everywhere. And I would say that number 4 for me is the one position that I don't quite get my head around as much. I don't mind being first drop and going out there at the first wicket. I've batted a lot at 6 and 7, and I've opened a lot and obviously been a tail ender, in better teams and all sorts of things. Number 4 is one position that I've never quite worked out the same way. I do think that, we'll probably change in the future and we won't call it number 4 anymore. We'll probably call it the anchor spot, right? Where you have this person who can play this role, and they won't always bat at number 4 because they'll throw other people down and all those sorts of things. But I do think there is something special about it. What I don't think is that there is a problem that India specifically has with number 4s compared to anyone else.
Yeah, no, definitely the numbers tell a similar story. But I think with respect to numbers 4 and 5, players are just expected to be very, very adaptable and dynamic even, because there'll be situations in which you need to come out and hit the ball from ball 1. And then in certain cases, you'll have to play, or become that crisis man who digs your team out of a hole and, steadies the ship and then accelerates. So, yeah, there are a lot of, shades of that position. And you need to be a very well-rounded sort of batter who can think across multiple sort of scenarios to perform in that position, I suppose. But coming to, India once again, you spoke about how there might be a lack of role clarity also in these last 4-ish years, or even post-Yuvraj or whatever. And now once again we're seeing that India have all of these options at number 4, and we don't know exactly what they're going to go with. It's still a mystery. And obviously, with respect to the situation of the game, someone might be promoted like Hardik or someone. So, role clarity. Do you think that is the first and foremost thing that India needs to focus on if they want to win this World Cup?
I think it's too late if they haven't focused on it already. But I think that while we have 50-over World Cups, and while most of the best players don't play any List A cricket and don't play that often for the national team, you're going to get some World Cups where you turn up and the players just aren't ready for the jobs. I'm not sure that's necessarily going to be a case with India and number 4s in this World Cup. But we probably have between 2 and 4 50-over World Cups left. It might be 2, it might be 3, I don't know.
You're making me sad.
Yeah, we certainly have one more after this, so we have 2. I would say, I would almost guarantee that. But after that, I don't know, right? But the more World Cups we play when people aren't playing 50-over cricket means the trickier this is, right? Like, look at Ireland. Ireland put so much into their white ball cricket. You know, that they're so upset they haven't qualified for this because they had focused so much on becoming a really good one-day cricket. They had 2 number 4s, right? They weren't experimenting. Yeah. What is going on?
Oh, now it's your birthday? We've got balloons on the screen.
That is
for people who are just listening in.
But I put my fingers up. Why are my fingers balloons? Anyway.
I don't know. Maybe it's a Riverside thing. Maybe it's your new laptop.
I'm really sorry. Now I'm trying to make it do things, but it's not doing. The reason they had the 2 though is because they were trying to win all those games, right? And they were picking. I would assume it was. I don't even know. Probably would have been Lorcan Tucker and the other guy whose name I've forgotten, who's really good. But it's probably the same guys over and over again because that was the position. Not Lorcan Tucker, the other guy. Harry Tector is the guy I meant.
Yeah, Harry Tector.
I don't know who their other number 4 was. I didn't check out. But they're trying to win every single game. That means that if you bat at number 4 for Ireland, you really know your role, right?
Yeah.
And that is not the case for a lot of different people when it comes to T20 cricket.
What about someone
cricket,
what about someone like Aiden Markram? He, I think, is the modern day Yuvraj with respect to the way he bats, and he offers a bit with the ball as well. Averages probably mid-30s, goes at a high strike rate. I think that's the kind of number 4 you really need, though, don't you?
But
in the modern era.
He's only just worked out how to play that position, right? He's actually been struggling. Aiden Markram's a phenomenal talent. I don't think people realize how talented he is and how good he could have been and might still become, later on. He's really disappointed so far in his career. And
he's one of those few South Africans who has a World Cup trophy.
But I still think he didn't play enough. But again, to go back to what we were just talking about, that South African top 6, and I know they've moved around a little bit. Rassie's been at 3 and 4, and Klaassen hasn't always been there, and Miller, and all these. But more or less, that top 6, they absolutely know how to play one-day cricket coming into this tournament, right? New Zealand have got players who haven't played a lot of one-day cricket coming in. Australia have got players who haven't played a lot of one-day cricket in their positions coming in. Even England have got an opener who's not normally an opener, right? That's what we're seeing a lot now. And we're seeing that because people don't play enough one-day cricket anymore, and they never will again. I'm sorry to break your heart.
Yeah, no. I am definitely seeing that trend. And even after, that statement by Mark Nicholas, I don't know if it was this podcast or the last one in which I mentioned it, but the MCC president has also mentioned it, right? That you're trying things again?
Yeah, I was
Jarrod
trying to make the screen do something.
At the camera. It's interesting, because obviously we'll all be keeping a very, very close eye on India. And I guess just on a closing note, also, sorry, you were mentioning extreme trends in data. Well, Usman Khwaja's test career, that's one that I got off from you as well. That's also very erratic. But one final thought then. If you had to pick one number 4 for India to play the entire World Cup, would it be KL Rahul or someone else?
It doesn't matter to me if it's KL Rahul or Shreyas Iyer because I think they both can do the job. I probably think for Shreyas Iyer, I would have preferred for him to play more cricket coming in for me to be more confident in him. It's not a talent thing. It's just that he hasn't done it as much as he should have. But his record is fine. As you said, he's bringing in India. So I don't have an issue with either one of those 2 players. And then, they're not losing by picking one over the other, right?
Yeah.
And so I would say that KL Rahul is probably going to do that job. And again, he's got all the skills to be able to do that. I remember he played in a one-day series against England batting at number 5.
What I think in this regard is that if the selection call over here is do they play Ishan Kishan or Shreyas Iyer? And if they choose Shreyas Iyer over Ishan Kishan, they might go Iyer at 4. I just have a feeling.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. That's what I was going to say is that I think because KL Rahul can bat 5, right? It probably makes more sense for him to bat at 5, and Shreyas Iyer is way more not one-dimensional, but way more a number 4 only type of player. So that gives you that sort of flexibility if you want to be able to do that. I've got absolutely no issue with that at all. And then Ishan Kishan can come in if there's an injury or if there's a problem with one of those other 2 players. They've got options.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we've had enough conversation on debunking the myth that India is terrible batting at number 4. Of course, they're not the best at it. But, if anyone wants to look into this further, Jarrod's done an entire piece on it. Go check it out. And that'll be it for this episode of the FootMarks podcast. Thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you, Jarrod, for your time. And you'll catch us again next week with episode 21. For now, that's all. Goodbye.